On.
Welcome to your video lesson on ancient Egypt. We're starting in Google Earth because I wanted to show you where the Nile River is. The Nile River is going to be central to the history of ancient Egypt. As you can see from the map, the Nile runs right down the center of a desert area that is the rest of Egypt. The Nile is a major north-flowing river in northeastern Africa and is commonly regarded as the longest river in the world. Let's take a look at what we can see from the Nile River. This view really shows clearly how how much desert there is around the Nile. And also when we were zooming in here, you could see the cities in Egypt that are even today set up central to the Nile. Let's go to some of the history. The fertile land of the Nile River Valley drew settlers as early as 5000 BC to Egypt. The Nile River and its lush valley contrast sharply with nearby deserts. But deserts have a benefit too. The deserts isolated Egypt and protected Egypt from invaders. The ancient Egyptians sailed the Nile for travel and trade, which is another reason why it was so central to the growth and development of Egypt.
The Nile was such an important part of life in Egypt that a hymn was dedicated to it in about 2100 BC. Listen to this excerpt from the hymn. Hail to thee, O Nile, who manifests thyself over this land and comes to give life to Egypt. Mysterious is thy issuing forth from the darkness on this day whereon it is celebrated. Watering the orchards created by Re to cause all the cattle to live, you give the earth to drink, inexhaustible one.
The Egyptians had almost a religious fervor when discussing their commitment and their dedication to celebrating the Nile River. This information compares the Nile to some of the other longest rivers in the world. You can see the Nile is longer than the Amazon, America's longest river, the Mississippi, and longer by far than these other top 15 longest Niles in the world. Ancient Egyptians used the Nile's predictable flooding for agricultural purposes. Basically, the Nile would flood at the same time every year, and that allowed the Egyptians to plan for when they would farm. It also created the development of silt, which is a clay-like soil that is very fertile and allowed for a lot of farming. Farmers developed tools and farming technology such as irrigation canals. Irrigation canals allowed them to water farmland outside of the direct area of the Nile. Egyptians gathered the papyrus plant and used them to weave objects and to make paper. Papyrus is really the oldest form of paper in the world. That led to Egyptians developing their own writing systems of symbols that represented objects, ideas, and sounds, and those are known as hieroglyphics. This primary source represents farming on the Nile. Farmers grew crop surpluses or extra amounts that could be stored in the future for future needs or traded with other kingdoms. Irrigation systems allowed farmers to bring water from the Nile to their fields, increasing the amount of land that could be used for farming. Egyptians planted and harvested crops with tools like metal sickles, stone axes, and shovels. The Nile River flooding brought rich nutrients from the river to nearby farmland, making the land more fertile. Farmers rested during the Nile floods because after the floods, extra water was used to prepare new mud for hoeing and planting seeds. Farmers used donkeys to move goods and oxen to help plow the land. To use a shaduf, which is this high tool here, a farmer would pull down on a rope and lower the bucket into the water. A weight on the other end of the pole raises the filled bucket, making the task easier. An example of technology helping ancient civilizations do basic tasks in an easier way. Papyrus grew wild along the banks of the Nile River. Egyptians cut, pressed, and layered the inner part of the stalk. Until the AD 700 or 800s, Egyptians used papyrus to make paper. The first step of the process is they would harvest the wild papyrus that grew along the Nile. Then they would peel, cut, and layer the stalks. The layers were wetted and pressed to seal layers together. Sheets were dried and bleached by the sun. Sheets were pressed and bound together to make a papyrus roll. Artists inscribed, illustrated, and wrote on the papyrus. And if you look really closely here, that's where you could see those hieroglyphics.
Several major trade routes in the ancient world reached Egypt.
The period from about 2000 BC to 2200 BC is known as the Old Kingdom. During the Old Kingdom, Egyptians built great cities, increased trade, and formed a unified government. Unified means similar to the United States, that the government is united despite being over a large area of land. The pharaoh held total power as the ruler of the kingdom. Egyptians believed the pharaoh was a god on earth and considered him a religious leader as well as a political leader. Because the pharaoh was believed to be a god, Egypt is known as a theocracy. The word parts there are a good hint that that is a type of government that involves religion as well. The Egyptians worshipped many deities, believing that they controlled natural forces and human actions. Because they worshipped many deities, they're also known as polytheistic. The poly refers to many. That same word part of the refers to religion. So they believed in many gods. The Egyptians believed in life after death, at first only for pharaohs, but later for people and animals. The embalming processes, including mummification, which is the development of people into mummies, protected the body in the afterlife. The Egyptians learned about the human body and developed medical practices, which they recorded on papyrus scrolls. The Egyptians built tombs known as pyramids to house the bodies of the pharaohs and their belongings. Construction crews spent years of hard labor to build each pyramid, and we'll debate whether or not those were comprised mainly of slaves. The challenging of building the pyramids led to many engineering, mathematical, and technological discoveries. The Great Pyramid, built in the mid-2000s BC for King Khufu, was the world's tallest structure for more than 4,000 years. The Great Pyramids of Giza are shown here with the Sphinx of Giza, which is a really famous example of imagery that people associate with Egypt. Over 4,400 years ago, ancient Egyptians constructed the pyramids of Giza along the west bank of the Nile. The enormous pyramids and temples, including the Great Pyramid of Giza, became known as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Today, the United Nations recognizes the pyramids as a part of a World Heritage Site. This status helps to preserve pyramids for future generations. I'll show you on Google Earth. There's some really cool things that you could see from the Great Pyramids at Giza. And even like today, it's funny, it's kind of become like a tourist site. When you zoom out, you can see like the McDonald's and the Starbucks that are nearby. But it is somewhere that you could still visit, even if you were going to go today. Notice again, it's located really close to the Nile River. And if we popped our little guy out here from Street View, you can kind of really look up and see